Well, I'm asking a simple question, or two questions. Has the role of war in human societies declined through the ages and recently? And has violence, in the sense of violence within societies, declined? Though I'll be focusing more on war. Well, in the 19th century, just about every social theorist thought that war was declining or was shortly about to decline. This started with Kant and his notion of perpetual peace, which he didn't think was reality but could become reality. Montesquieu, Saint-Simon, well, you see the list. And they lived in an era of comparative peace, at least in Europe, because they seem to have neglected the colonialism they were all practicing, these countries were all practicing at the same time. And there were four alternative theories of decline, and I list them here. Notions of industrial society, Herbert Spencer is the best example of that. Capitalist society, Karl Marx, obviously. Markets, which tended to be John Stuart Mill and other political economists, and democracy. Now, the American war against Spain in 1898 brought forth some disagreement in the US, and Sumner, who opposed the war, made this remark that he knew that his side were losing the argument, and he said, sadly, man is addicted to war. But World War I produced a more general change, especially in Germany, where Weber, Simmel, and Scheler, in the early part of World War I, they noted the importance of war, which Weber had already done, but also supported Germany's entry into the war. Weber's famous remark, if Europe is not to be dominated by Russian bureaucracy, French rationalism, and British capitalism, then we must fight to preserve German culture. Of course, he changed midway through the war and became a critic of the war. Now, in the first half of the 20th century, obviously it was a bit difficult to believe that war was declining because of the two world wars. And indeed, people stopped writing in that vein. But what most of them preferred to do, apart from fascists, was to forget about war and write about something more cheerful. So there really wasn't very much theory of warfare in the first half of the 20th century. And sociology, political science to a lesser extent, but certainly sociology, neglected war. The most famous studies in sociology were of American and German troops, combat troops. It became very much organization of the military rather than war. And the famous class struggle metaphors, war between the classes and the like, of Marxists was just a metaphor. Nobody expected that you would have to fight really hard for the revolution. Fight in the sense of kill people. And then came the Cold War, which was fought through proxies for the most part, so that it was somewhat removed from us. Then the Cold War ended. The 1990s, optimism returned, 19th century optimism returned. And very recently, three major books have come out by John Mueller, Azar Gat, and Steven Pinker. And Pinker's book became a bestseller. And they detected a long-term, very long-term decline in both war and homicide, the internal violence I talked about. And my question is, are they correct? Now, they start with early human warfare. There's a major controversy among archaeologists and anthropologists about whether they practiced much war, early hunter-gatherers. The traditional belief was that they didn't, that hunter-gatherers were pretty pacific, and wars really started with the emergence of states. More recently, this man Keeley disputed this and came up with the conclusion that there are plenty of archaeological remains of skeletons with obvious wounds inflicted on them. And in fact, one was discovered just a few weeks ago in northeastern Kenya, 10,000-year-old group of skeletons, most of whom appeared to have, most of the ones that were relatively intact had wounds. They'd been hit by some heavy object. Now, this dispute still rages. Pinker and Gat, they both take the side of Keeley and say there's always been warfare. And Pinker makes the kind of not entirely satisfactory remark is that hunter-gatherers were involved in little wars that killed up to 60% of the population, meaning the maximum. But of course, that is a lower proportion than the genocides of the 20th century, about which I have written a book. Armenians, Jews, Tutsi in Rwanda, these have been more than 60%. In fact, most archaeologists and historians, ancient historians, say that the rise of the state brought more wars. Now, with ancient empires, we face the context of there are civilizations who left remains, texts and inscriptions on stone, glorifying their own war machines and claiming to have eliminated hundreds of thousands of people. And the Assyrians were obvious examples of that. And it's come down into kind of popular beliefs that the Assyrians wiped out whole populations. Well, this seems not to be true. Assyriologists say that they used exemplary repression, which means if a city resisted and didn't surrender, when they took it, they would have a general slaughter of really the whole population, but most of the population, and certainly the elite. This was meant to be exemplary because it would show other cities what would happen if they resisted. So they normally gave in. So that it was general slaughter in particular places, and it was done for a strategic reason and wasn't like the genocides of the 20th century. And that was also true of the Romans. To the extent that a people or a city resisted them, they would be very severe. Decimation, 1 in 10, was the normal process. But these empires wanted to rule over people, not to exterminate them. They wanted the surplus. However, with all of this about early societies, one has to admit that the sources are poor and one cannot be decisive in one's final judgments. Now, what Pinker does among these three writers, he provides a massive number of statistics about warfare and homicide rates. And so it's his rates of warfare here, which I have presented now. Now, I hope you can read that. There's a lot of text. His table in the book has 21, the top 21 cases of war-related deaths. I found that was just too many for a single screen, so I've taken his top 14. Now, what this is the war-related deaths in millions, okay? Now, the first relevant column is of actual deaths, absolute number of deaths. Okay, and what we find here is that World War II has slaughtered more people than any other war. And Mao's great leap forward is number 2. The Mongols were number 3, except that if you want to know how many people the Mongols slaughtered, and you go on the web, you will find continuously the statement of that we don't know exactly, but it's between 30 and 60 million. This is an enormous figure. But there seems to be no actual source for that. It's one of those internet facts which spreads around and has no basis. And experts on the Mongols say, well, they did slaughter a lot of people, but it's more likely something like 11 or 12 million, which would reduce the Mongols considerably. In this table, in this absolute table. Number 4 is a very old one as well. Number 5 is quite old. But if you look at these, there are 5 of the top 14 which are in the 20th century. And actually, if we look at his whole 21, it's 7 that are in the 20th century. So one might think it was difficult to talk about a decline of war if the 20th century was the worst. But Pinker has a clever answer to that. It's that it's not the absolute number that counts, it's the relative number. That is, relative to the size of the population at the time. And of course, the population in 1945 was much, much, much higher than the population in Mongol times or in China in the 8th century, the An-Lushan War. So he does another column, which I reproduce here, relative deaths with standardized, I think, at the beginning of the 20th century. And relative deaths gives you a different ranking. World War II goes down to 8th, and there's number 1. Yeah. Number 1 is An-Lushan, but again there's a problem with An-Lushan. This figure of, this large figure of 36 million dead in China in the 8th century comes from the Chinese census before and after this great rebellion, well, this attempt by An-Lushan to become emperor. But the problem with that is that the war itself destroyed much of the census, and so the census administration is a partial one. So that figure is an artifact, and people say that it wasn't 36 million, but probably somewhere around 13 million. Of course, you know, these are estimates. It could be anything from, you know, if it's 13, it could be anything from 10 to 20. But on his figures, An Lushan becomes number one, and it still isn't number one with the lower figure. And number two are the Mongols, and number three, well, the slave trade. The slave trade is a little bit odd, actually, but anyway. So he says, well, this proves a decline in war, because relative to the population, the number of killed has declined. But I have added another column. I think we also have to standardize for the duration of the war. I mean, if you look at that column, you can see that the Mongol conquests are about 100 years. The slave trade, according to Pinker himself, is 1,200 years. I think that's an overestimate, but that's what he writes. That's the Middle East slave trade. But World War II only lasted for 8 years, if you count the 1937 Japanese invasion of China. So surely more meaningful are the killings per year. If you're aggregating all of the Mongol killings by different Khans, different ethnic groups, then aren't you covering several kind of wars? And with the duration taken into account, World War II rises back to number one. An Lushan is either 2 or 8. And World War I becomes probably number 2, both in the 20th century. Taiping Rebellion, number 3, which is in the 19th century, etc. You can figure it out. So that, if we take into account the duration of wars, then the killing rate is bigger if the less time the war lasts. Now, and these are the problems with his data, some of which I've already mentioned. So I'll go down to the last point, the last criticism, which is the 20th century cases. There are 5 20th century cases here. He separates them into, that's 6 is there because of his original listing of 21, 6 of 21, and in my case 5 out of 14. World War I, World War II, the Russian Civil War, the Chinese Civil War, the atrocities of Stalin, and Mao's Great Leap Forward. They're all within 50 years, half the length of time of the Mongol conquests, and they're all connected. Without World War I, for example, no Russian Revolution or Civil War. Without World War II, no communism in China. I mean, you might argue with that, but if you read my 3rd and 4th volumes, you'll see that I prove it. So this is easily the most violent half-century in the history of humanity. If you count them all as one case, then there's far more killed, either absolutely or relatively, than earlier cases. Now I turn to homicide. Now this is the strongest argument of Pinker, Gat, and Mueller. But there has been a long-term decline in homicide since, well, the earliest date that we can find coroner's reports, and therefore suicide rates, murder rates is 14th century. Mainly English figures, but some Dutch and Swedish. And it's clear that Europe, the US, and more recently Japan, have seen a long-term decline in homicide. They're pacified, which various theorists had also said. Foucault, Giddens, and myself. The growth of state infrastructural power includes greater provision of order, and therefore less violence around by anything other than the state. But there are exceptions. The homicide rate in the 50 worst cities in the world is higher than 14th century Oxford. Now I'll pause there and tell you about 14th century Oxford. The main original studies claim that the murder rate was 110 per 100,000. Right? But other historians have said that's implausible. There are 6 other English studies, and they produce an average rate of 24, and none of them is higher than 50. It appears that the first person had minimized the population of Oxford. Now it's interesting, actually, that they know the social status of the murderers, and in the Oxford case, half of them are academics or students. Right? Murderous lot, academics, students. In fact, there's a lot of television detectives today in Oxford. Inspector Morse, Inspector Lewis, Constable Endeavour, these are all TV series. And I calculate that their murder rate is about the same as 14th century Oxford, and that half of them are academics or students. So there are similarities. But what this means, Oxford's rate today is less than 1 per 100,000. Well, of course, most of the worst cities are in Latin America. LA here doesn't mean the next door neighbor here, it means Latin America. But 4 of the top 50, in fact, these are top 10, Detroit and New Orleans, so that America lags a bit. And this is how Pinker sees it, as a lagged civilizing process. And he says the US high rates are in black communities and or the South, and civilization hasn't reached them yet. Well, if you did this in other countries, that is, if you excluded the groups who have the highest rates, then you'd bring down their rates as well. So and problems of political correctness arise too, here, in terms of identifying African Americans as murderers. But Pinker says eventually all the countries will be pacified. Now here I want to introduce a theoretical distinction introduced by Randall Collins who distinguished two main types of killing, which he called ferocious and callous. Ferocious violence is hacking bodies with swords, spears, and the like. The most you get is archers, who can still see their victims because of the range of bows and crossbows. Indeed, since hacking other bodies was the essential military skill of the ordinary soldier, ferocious citizens were considered desirable. And so the corollary of ferocious war was ferocious homicide. And more homicide, in fact, more homicide. Now, callous killing is of unseen victims, done at a distance. And what I'm saying is that the West has moved, Japan too, has moved from ferocious to callous killing. Now, we don't, or not many of us, shoot and knife our enemies, and we don't hack at the bodies of victims in modern warfare. As all three of these authors point out, torture, rape, horrify us. The notion of public executions we find horrific. The chopping off of hands in Saudi Arabia of people accused of stealing offends us. But on the other hand, we regard torture and rape and the like as awful. And so we regard ISIS as being peculiarly awful. But we don't mind about long-distance killing, or at least we don't make a fuss about it. Now, I want to quote you here what William Sterling Parsons, who was the commander and bombardier of the Enola Gay, which dropped the first atom bomb on Hiroshima. He wrote in his log immediately after he dropped the first bomb, "Results clear-cut, successful in all respects, visible effects greater than any test, conditions normal in airplane following delivery." Now that's very prosaic, and it reveals his kind of, it's a kind of matter of bureaucratic efficiency. And that's an example of callousness. Bombing in general is, and drones are. That is, they're done at a long distance. They don't really impinge in our lives. We don't have to be trained in violence people don't have to be trained in martial arts and the like to fight in wars like this. But we kill, through our drones and our bombs, far more Syrians and Iraqis than ISIS can do. And yet one really horrifies us and the other doesn't. And so there can be killing without an overtly violent culture. And of course we do have a fairly pacified culture. Nothing like that of the Middle Ages or the ancient Rome or the like. So I'm obviously going to be arguing further that callous killing remains and has to a degree supplanted ferocious killing. Now, since 1945, it's like the 19th century. It appears to have been a period of peace. And there's definitely been a decline in the number of interstate wars. Wars used to be the backbone of states. And, I've written about, lots of people have now written about the fiscal military nexus, that as medieval states fought wars, they needed a bigger fiscal apparatus. State bureaucracy developed. The growth of the state is connected with war. That's Tilley's remark, war makes the state and states make war. But clearly, in the more advanced countries, war is no longer the major backbone of states. We might denounce military spending, but it's a small proportion, 5% of GDP, whereas it could rise to 20-30% in historic times. So, in the past, for at least a millennium, 1,000 years, Europeans had fought more wars than anyone else. And there was an average of, averages differ a little, but something like 1.3 wars per year. So Europeans were from Mars. But suddenly, Europeans are from Venus. If you take away the little incursions into other countries now and then of Britain and France, it's completely without wars. So war weariness by the Europeans and the desire not to repeat it again is one of the causes of this. Another one is the end of empires, apart from the US. Andreas Wimmer has shown 2 spikes in the frequency of wars in the last 150 years. The first one is the period of colonial conquests. The second one is the period of anti-colonialism and the establishing of new states. So that's over now, and so there's a decline in war. And the third cause is mutually assured destruction. That is the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union very quickly realized that a nuclear war could destroy not only the enemy but themselves. And then there is also a growth of international regulation, which happens in some continents more than others, especially Africa, the African Union, and the almost total absence of interstate wars in Africa. And finally, a high degree of globalized interdependence. But of course, the decline of interstate wars has been replaced by a rise in civil wars ever since the 1930s. About half of these civil wars are ethnic, but half are regional, is the most common, or religious. Between the 1930s and the 1990s, there was a substantial rise, and then it leveled off and even declined slightly. But then there was a second peak from 2010, which we're still in. Now, okay, this is them. This is not us. This is far away. This is the problems of poor countries, etc. That's what we tend to think. But civil wars don't actually stay within national boundaries. They involve proxy war by various groups. They involve intervention by neighboring countries and by countries that are far away. If we think about the ones going on now or in recent years, there's the Eastern Congo, in which an enormous people have been killed. 9 African countries have contributed to the African Union force which is in there. And you know, some of them are clearly stirring things up, like Rwanda, especially Rwanda. In Mali, France and Chad are involved, plus with the help of US logistical support. Somalia involves the US and and various African Union states. Colombia involves the US. Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, the US and most of NATO. Libya, 17 states, NATO plus Gulf states. Syria, obviously, the US, much of NATO, Iraq, Jordan, Iran, Hezbollah, and now Russia. The eastern Ukraine, Russia, with a more equivocal American support in the west of the Ukraine. And this foreign intervention is also common against non-state militias, like Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and the Lord's Resistance Army, which is in Uganda. And these groups are themselves transnational, going through. Now, there are some, well, but before I comment on this, of course, we're also involved in supplying weapons. Arms transfers are enormous, especially from the US. And so we are fueling, we have highly profitable industries engaged in faraway countries. So this is kind of callous warfare. It doesn't impinge on our daily lives. We see an item on the television news, and if Americans don't get killed, there's no fuss about it, it just goes on. Okay, this is world battle deaths, 1946 to 2002. And you can see a decline, obviously, in battles. I'd like to be able to get this data for other continents too. But what this gives you is the ratio of battle deaths to total deaths, civilian deaths. And you can see that the percentage of battle deaths is extremely low. The highest one is Somalia, perhaps a quarter or a fifth or a quarter of the deaths are of troops. But most of them are very low. Now, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the last one, there are 2 major estimates of the total casualties. The one that's quoted very often is 4.2 million. But there's been another international attempt to measure, which would come out at about 2.5, 2.6. So I've taken the lower figure, but it might be the higher figure, in which case only 3% of the dead would be in battle. So what we can see is the nature of the war has changed. And civilians are far more affected. It's not known what proportion of them have suffered the kind of ferocious war versus callous war, but a large number of them have been kind of hacked. And obviously that was often the case in Rwanda, which isn't here. So the world is suffering from warfare, even if the number of battle deaths is going down. And this is the number of conflicts with more than 25 deaths. And you can see overall it's reasonably flat. Well, it jumps around a bit, but on a basis of going around a particular level, one-sided violence where there's one very powerful group and a very easily massacring a lower one, that's declined. The others have not. And just in case you think that, you won't think now, but if I was doing this 3 years ago, you might be surprised by this. But world military expenditure, this is another measure of the importance of war, was going down from 1988 to about 1998, and then it started increasing to a level higher than any of the others, and it's been around the same level for the last 5 years, except that 2015 has seen an increase. So, in conclusion, there's been a long-term decline in homicide in the West. The US lags a little bit because of its gun culture. But in this respect, Pinker, Gat, and Mueller are right. But there's been a shift from ferocious to callous warfare. So it involved indirectly through arms sales, proxies, that is, arming and encouraging groups in foreign countries to fight, and small interventions. A lot of small interventions. But our culture is no longer violent. We no longer have support for torture, for hacking at bodies and the like. But what we do have is acceptance of death administered at a distance. Now, interstate, there's been no long-term decline in interstate wars. I hope I've proved that. Until after 1945, especially in Europe, and a bit later, East Asia, after its wars ended. This has been replaced by civil wars in other parts of the globe, but they're often internationalized, first in the Cold War, and then in these different forms that I have just presented, in which civilian deaths greatly outweigh battle deaths. Now, for the future, it is possible that things will improve or that they will get a lot worse. And here we've got three particular bad scenarios. Confrontation between the US and China, nuclear war, which can be started in various ways, though nuclear powers have tended to come in pairs, where it's easy to see mutually assured destruction. The US and the Soviet Union, India and Pakistan. If you do have 6 nuclear powers in the Middle East, well, then things get very dangerous because wars can start without anybody actually wanting this, like the First World War. And the third one, environmental wars. If we don't deal with climate change, then many countries millions of people will suffer, and they will try and be refugees, or may even try and fight to come to the Northern American states, to Canada and the like. And the North Americans, by that I mean half of the US, not here, a bit further north, a wall, a frontier wall across, manned by troops who will shoot anyone who tries to come through. Now that's a worst case scenario, but it's a possibility. So there are alternative scenarios possible for the future. There might be a long-term decline of civil wars, though it doesn't seem to be happening yet. And the optimists were mostly wrong. Now, this is, some people think, well, therefore it's human nature that's the problem. But early hunter-gatherers, no remains of skeletons indicating battle wounds have been found before 12,000 BC. Now that might seem a long time for there to be wars, but the previous period, which is longer than that of humanity, seems not to have had any, or not to have any that archaeologists have yet found. Of course, they may find it earlier in the past. Which means that it's not in our kind of genes, because we share almost all the genes with those early hunter-gatherers. It's not in our biological makeup for us to make war. It does seem to be ubiquitous, not universal, but ubiquitous in countries with states, and peoples with states. On the other hand, there are long periods of peace. If we think of Tokugawa, Japan, Scandinavian countries since 1810, China from about 1650 to 1890, so that it has been possible to almost eliminate war in various cultures for long periods of time. Of the cases I mentioned, only Sweden is the one that has maintained that throughout. Scandinavia, I should say. So it's clear that warfare is an ever possible outcome in state rivalry, or rival between states and barbarians. Right? The causes of war is a very complex subject which I won't touch on now, but it seems that the same problems confront us as confronted earlier civilizations. One has a strong sense when you read historical accounts about the starting of other wars that sometimes the decision making is done by very, very small groups of people. Decisions that might have gone otherwise. For example, if An Lushan had not declared himself the emperor of China but had been content with his previous status, well, millions of people would have been spared. And so it is a political issue, and we should all put as much pressure on for peace. I'm sure you know that already. Thank you.